In a town where cruelty wore a sheriff's badge and girls were sold like livestock, they said she was worthless, just 16, obese, untouched, and traded for 3 like spoiled meat. But when the trader's wagon snapped on the edge of the wild, something ancient stirred in the woods. A man giant, feared, and silent stepped from the mountain mist. No one knew why he took her hand instead of turning away. Was it mercy, madness, or something sacred buried deep beneath his grief? What kind of love grows where the world only plants shame, and what does it take to heal a ghost? When a girl is sold like cattle and a giant steps from the mountain mist, one question lingers. Was it fate, or something deeper than either of them could see? Every time I read your comments, I'm reminded that stories like this still matter because they speak to the part of us that refuses to turn away from pain or from hope. If you still believe in second chances, in quiet strength, and in love that chooses the broken, then you're part of this story, too. Drop a comment with the state you're watching from, like the video, and subscribe for more. The sky hung low over the town of Wetlock, thick with August heat and the sour taste of dust. Horses shifted in the cracked dirt near the saloon, and the air smelled of sweat, whiskey, and resignation. No one spoke when Charles Gentry dragged his daughter out by the wrist. 16 years old and twice the width of any girl her age, Marybeth stumbled, cheeks red not from sun but shame. Her boots scuffed the wood of the porch as he yanked her down the steps, one meaty hand clamped around her thin arm like iron. She didn't cry. She never did any more. $3, Charles barked to the trader, a man with slick hair, yellow teeth, and a ledger for a heart. That's what you said. I said I'd look, the man said, eyeing the girl like she was a mule with a twisted leg. Not pay. She's untouched, Charles sneered, gripping his daughter tighter. Big, sure, but not stupid. She can cook. So, keep her mouth shut. Marybeth stared at the ground, trying to disappear into the dirt. The trader stepped forward, lifting her chin with 2 fingers. Her eyes were soft, brown, and terrified but not empty. He saw something there, something unbroken, and it annoyed him. He spat. Fine, 3, but I ain't paying for feed. He tossed 3 silver dollars into Charles's calloused hand. The coins clinked together like shackles, final and cold. A rope was tied around Marybeth's wrists, not tight enough to hurt, just enough to make the message clear. You don't belong to yourself now. She was led to the back of the wagon, past bundles of dried goods and spare tools, and lifted roughly onto the hay. Her dress clung to her, damp and wrinkled, and she curled inward, hiding her face behind thick arms. No one said a word. Not the preacher who stood frozen in the chapel doorway, not the butcher who watched from behind his curtain of flies, not even the boys who'd once thrown rocks at her belly and shouted barnyard names. They all looked on with that same expressionless hush, the kind that lets injustice pass like a dust storm, choking but temporary. Only one voice broke the stillness. An old woman in a brown shawl, crooked with time, stepped out from beside the apothecary's door. Her eyes glinted like river stones, clear and sharp. She didn't look at Charles. She didn't look at the trader. She looked at the girl, then the trees beyond the hill. He'll regret this before the frost, she said. The trader snorted. Crazy old crone. But Charles stiffened. For a flicker of a moment, his knuckles went white around the coins. Then he turned, shoved the money into his pocket, and walked away like he was stepping out of a room filled with rot. The wagon rolled on, creaking beneath its load, and Marybeth watched the town disappear between slats of wood. No one waved, no one wept. Only the wind moved, curling through the sycamore branches like it knew something they didn't. Far beyond the town, hidden past the tree line and the bluffs, a pair of eyes opened, watching, waiting. The wheels groaned beneath the weight of the wagon as it jostled over narrow trails carved through the high brush, rattling like bones against the rocks. The trader didn't speak much. He spat, cursed at the mules, and chewed tobacco that dribbled from his lip like black venom. Marybeth sat in the back, her wrists chafed from the rope and her skin raw from the sun. 3 days had passed since Wetlock, and she had eaten only a heel of bread and half a bruised apple. Her stomach clenched in long, aching knots, but she made no complaint. She'd learned the cost of speaking, The wagon passed under the shadow of pine trees that thickened with every mile. The air cooled, whispering of altitude and danger. Birds went silent. The forest here was older than the townsfolk dared remember, its canopy heavy, its undergrowth dense and unwelcoming. Marybeth watched it from her hunched seat, the trees flickering by like sentinels. There was something in them, something that seemed to look back. At dusk on the fourth day, the trail narrowed to a ribbon of dirt along the edge of a ravine. One wheel had already splintered, and the trader had patched it with rope and wire. The mules hesitated. The wind changed. The sky had been clear only an hour ago, but now clouds rolled fast across it, heavy with storm. Marybeth pressed her arms around her middle and ducked lower into the wagon, trying to disappear into the hay. Then the wheel snapped. A jolt threw her sideways. She hit the floor hard, her shoulder cracking against the frame. The wagon lurched, tilted, then groaned to a halt at an angle that made the mules bray in protest. The trader roared with anger, leapt down, and began shouting at the wheel as though it had betrayed him personally. He didn't notice Marybeth had bled from her arm, nor did he care. "Damn this road," he spat. "Damn this forest, and damn that fat girl's weight for snapping it clean." Marybeth swallowed the words that rose in her throat. She closed her eyes and tried to think of nothing. No town, no father, no shame, just stillness, just silence. But the forest was not still. It began with the wind rising sudden and sharp, stirring the needles in the trees with a whisper like breath. Then came the thunder, low and rumbling, not overhead but ahead, echoing from somewhere deep in the woods. The trader looked up, frowning. Lightning split the sky, too distant to strike but close enough to warn. And then something moved in the trees. Marybeth saw it first. A shape, half shadow, half man, stepped out from the line of pines not 20 yards away. He was tall, taller than any man she had ever seen, and cloaked in something dark and coarse like bear hide. His face was hooded, obscured by beard and shadow. He stood utterly still, as if carved from the very earth. The trader saw him and reached for the rifle lashed to the seat. "You best move along," he shouted, trying to sound braver than he felt. "Ain't nothing here for you." The figure did not answer. "Move along," I said. He barked again, now fumbling to load the gun. Still the man did not move. Then slowly he tilted his head and looked straight at Marybeth. Something inside her chest shifted, a low thrum like a forgotten heartbeat. The trader lifted the rifle. The man took one step forward. Thunder cracked again, louder this time, and the wind surged. The mules reared, whinnying in panic, and the trader stumbled. But Marybeth didn't move. She sat frozen, staring into the woods, into the eyes of a man not yet known, not yet understood, but suddenly, unshakably real. The forest held its breath. The trader lifted the rifle to his shoulder with shaking hands, trying to steady the barrel even as the wind howled through the trees like some ancient warning. Rain had not yet fallen, but the air was soaked with it, heavy and cold. The figure at the edge of the woods remained still, save for the slight lift of his shoulders with each breath. He looked like he belonged there, as much a part of the forest as the gnarled trunks behind him. "Get gone, you damned bear," the trader snarled, voice cracking. "Ain't your business what I carry." The man said nothing. "Last warning," the trader barked, thumbing back the hammer. Then, from beneath the low hang of his hood, the man spoke. His voice was deep, slow, and hollow as thunder that rolls across the valley floor. "Leave her." The words landed like an axe in the silence. The mules jerked in their harnesses, eyes wild. Marybeth blinked, barely breathing. The trader scoffed a nervous, high-pitched laugh that betrayed the fear in his throat. "Leave her?" he echoed. "She's bought and paid. Ain't your place, wild man. You don't get to say." He fired. The shot rang out, cracking through the air, but it went wide. The rifle kicked too hard, the trader's hands too slick with sweat. The figure didn't flinch, didn't step back, only moved forward, boots crunching pine needles and damp earth. "You gone deaf?" the trader snapped, backing toward the wagon. I said, the man reached it first. With a motion that was both impossible and effortless, he placed his great hands beneath the wagon bed and heaved. Wood creaked, mules shrieked, and the entire back end of the wagon lifted into the air, wheels dangling like broken limbs. Marybeth tumbled from the tilted bed, hitting the ground with a thud that knocked the wind from her chest. She scrambled back, breath ragged, staring up in disbelief, as the mountain man held the wagon aloft with a grim, quiet strength. The trader stumbled backward, tripping over a rock, falling into the mud. "Take your coin," the man said, voice low, "and leave." The trader didn't argue. He bolted for the forest's edge, boots slipping, curses tumbling from his mouth until even his echoes vanished. Marybeth lay still in the dirt, the world spinning. Her knees were scraped, her dress soaked through, her mind frozen between terror and wonder. She had never seen a man like him. Not just in size, but in presence. The way he moved as though time bent to him. The way the forest hadn't dared to resist his coming. He turned toward her, and she flinched. He didn't reach for her. He didn't speak. He only walked slowly, carefully toward a fallen log near the clearing. From his shoulder, he unrolled a wool blanket, worn but clean, and set it gently on the log. Then he stepped back. Marybeth's heart thundered in her ears. She stared at the blanket, then at the man. He knelt, not to her but to the earth, as though waiting for it to decide. And for the first time in years, she wasn't being dragged, shouted at, or bartered. She was being given a choice, and somehow that terrified her more than anything. The sky darkened into bruised shades of blue and gray as the storm crept in, slow and steady, like a hunter that knew its prey could not run. Marybeth followed the giant man through the woods, her steps hesitant, uneven. He didn't look back often, but when he did, it was not with impatience or command. It was only to make sure she still walked behind him. She didn't know why her legs moved. Her body hurt, her thoughts were scrambled, and nothing about this path made sense. But there was something in the silence between them, something that felt less dangerous than the noise of the world she'd left behind. So she followed. They climbed through the forest, branches heavy with the threat of rain brushing her shoulders, needles tangling in her hair. Birds were gone. Even the insects seemed to hush. Eventually, just as the first drops began to fall, they crested a ridge and turned down a slope thick with moss and shadow. Nestled between three great fir trees was a cabin small, sturdy, built with care, and no wasted flourish. The wood was dark with age, the windows shuttered, the roof patched with bark and stone. It looked like it had grown there. The man stepped onto the porch, unlatched the door with a quiet creak, and stood aside. Marybeth hesitated. Her heart thudded as she crossed the threshold. Inside, the air was warm, not from sunlight, but from firelight steady and golden in a stone hearth at the far wall. The room smelled of pine and smoke and something faintly sweet, like dried berries. It was clean, but lived in. A single table stood by the window, a carved wooden chair beside it. Shelves lined the walls, holding jars, folded blankets, and tools. A ladder led up to a loft tucked beneath the sloped ceiling. The man said nothing. He walked to the table, set a chunk of bread and a small crock of something dark jam or beans on a tin plate, and poured water into a cup. Then he stepped back and pointed, not at her, but toward the ladder. The message was clear: food, rest, safety. Marybeth nodded, her throat too tight for words. She took the plate with both hands, trying not to tremble, and climbed slowly to the loft. It was simple, just a straw-stuffed mattress, a thick quilt, and a single narrow window that looked out over the trees. She sat cross-legged, eating in silence. The bread was coarse, but good. The water was cold and tasted like stone and sky. She didn't realize how hungry she'd been until the plate was clean. Below, she heard him moving quiet, methodical. He stoked the fire, shut the door against the storm. Then he lay down on a mat near the hearth, the sound of his weight settling into the floorboards. Marybeth curled up beneath the quilt. Her body ached, her wrists were sore, her mind was a blur of fear and disbelief. The tears came without warning, slow at first, then faster, silent sobs into the pillow. But there was no yelling, no fists, no footsteps coming after her. Only the fire, only the smell of pine, only the wind pressing gently against the walls like it, too, had found shelter for the night. And somehow, in that flickering hush, she slept. The days unfolded like pages in a forgotten book, quiet, rough-edged, and stained with time. Morning came slow in the mountains, with mist clinging to the branches and the sun fighting its way through thick pine canopies. Marybeth woke each day to the same rhythm: the smell of firewood smoke, the sound of an axe biting into timber, the low cluck of hens in the yard. There was no schedule, no shouted commands, no hunger or fear pressing her out of bed, only silence. And the silence, for the first time in her life, did not feel like punishment. The man she had learned his name by then, though not from his mouth, was Elias. She found it carved into the haft of a tool he left near the porch, neat and simple. Elias W. He never introduced himself. He never asked for hers. And yet, somehow, she knew he already knew it. He moved through the world with the patience of stone. Each morning, he chopped wood before the sun cleared the trees, stacking it neatly along the cabin wall. He fed the chickens, scattered feed for the deer that came at dusk, and tended to a small garden half swallowed by weeds but still blooming with stubborn sage and potatoes. He did not speak, not even in grunts, but each morning, beside the door to the loft, Marybeth found something waiting berries in a wooden bowl, a boiled egg wrapped in cloth, once even a comb with wide teeth that did not snag her thick hair. She kept her distance at first, eyes always wary, hands always curled near her chest. But the days passed with no harsh words, no hungry stares, no demand for anything in return. So, slowly, cautiously, she began to uncoil. In the loft, beneath a loose floorboard, Marybeth discovered a battered, leather-bound sketchbook. Its pages were yellowed and curled at the edges, some torn, some stained. Most were blank. Some bore faint sketches, trees, birds, the edge of the cabin roof seen from above. A few had words, now faded, in a looping, careful hand. She did not read them. Not yet. Instead, she found a piece of charcoal from the fire pit, and one evening she began to draw. It came back to her slowly, like a memory hiding in her fingertips. She sketched the slope of the cabin roof, the strange way the chickens waddled after Elias when he carried the feed, the mist as it curled between the tree trunks. She drew herself, once round-faced, eyes too big, sitting on the porch with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. She didn't know why she did it, only that it made the quiet feel fuller. Sometimes she left the book open on the table before climbing into the loft. The next morning, the page would be turned, nothing else, no comment, no sign, just a quiet acknowledgement. And once, after she had drawn the creek that ran behind the cabin, she found a small feather laid gently beside it, blue, from a jay. The silence between them remained, but it changed shape. It became a space not of fear, but of listening. And in that space, Marybeth began to feel something she had never dared hope for before. She began to feel safe. The sun had warmed the forest just enough to melt the frost from the mossy logs, and the air was thick with the scent of damp pine and coming rain. Marybeth knelt just beyond the clearing that marked the edge of Elias's cabin, her hands cupped gently around a tiny creature that trembled in pain. The squirrel was no bigger than a bundle of kindling, its back leg twisted at an unnatural angle, its breathing fast and shallow. She'd found it beneath the edge of a woodpile, its fur slick with dew, its eyes wide with fear. She murmured softly as she worked, words not meant to be heard but given anyway. Her fingers were clumsy but kind. She made a sling from the edge of an old handkerchief, splinting the leg with a whittled sliver of bark, and laid the squirrel in a shallow box lined with cotton from her pillow. She set it beside the hearth where it could keep warm, checking on it every hour, her heart aching with a quiet she couldn't explain. She didn't know Elias was watching. He stood at the edge of the tree line with a bundle of firewood in his arms, unmoving, his shadow stretched long in the fading light. He didn't interrupt, didn't step forward, just watched her crouched beside the hearth, brow furrowed in focus, hands tender and slow. Something in his chest tightened, something that had not moved in years. That evening, after she fed the squirrel a few drops of water from a spoon, she climbed the ladder to the loft and opened her sketchbook. By firelight, she drew with careful strokes, Elias, as she saw him now not as a monster or legend, but as a man crouching low, one large hand cradling the tiny squirrel with the same gentleness she imagined he once gave to something far more fragile. She didn't overwork the lines. It was simple, honest. She left the drawing on the table. She didn't expect anything. She didn't even know why she did it. But as she drifted to sleep that night, the squirrel nestled in its box, the fire crackling low, she felt something shift inside her like ice cracking under early spring sun. The next morning, light spilled through the loft window, soft and golden. She sat up and rubbed her eyes, and then she saw it. Her bed was remade, layered with fresh linens she had never seen before. Soft cotton, clean and pale as milk, folded with care. Atop them sat a wooden hairbrush, its handle carved with vines and mountain flowers. It was smooth to the touch, and heavy, like it had been made to last. She picked it up slowly, her hands trembling. No note, no sound from below. But she knew. She knew without needing to see him that Elias had left it there not as payment, not as barter, but as something far rarer. A gift. She pressed the brush to her chest, closed her eyes, and breathed in the scent of cedar. Downstairs, the squirrel twitched in its sleep, safe and still. And for the first time since arriving at the edge of the wild, Marybeth smiled. The sun crept high through the morning mist, its light slanting through the tall pines in golden ribbons that warmed the clearing. A quiet stillness hung in the air, broken only by the rustle of leaves and the occasional thump of hooves. One of Elias's goats, an ornery, long-legged nanny with a crooked horn, had slipped her tether again. Marybeth stood at the edge of the garden with a handful of greens in her apron, watching with curiosity as Elias tried to wrangle the escapee. He moved like someone not used to chasing anything that didn't respect his silence. The goat darted just out of reach each time he lunged, bleating mockingly as she ducked behind barrels, leapt over a fallen log, then circled back through the chicken coop with a clatter of feathers. Elias grunted once, then tried to outflank her, misjudging her turn, and stepping straight into a muddy patch, hidden beneath the tall grass. His boot slid, his arms pinwheeled, and with a heavy thud, he landed flat on his back in the dirt, arms splayed, beard tangled with bits of hay and pine needles. The goat stopped, stared at him, then trotted off, as if satisfied with her victory. It caught Marybeth by surprise. A laugh escaped her, not loud, not mocking, just a soft, sudden sound from somewhere deep in her belly. She covered her mouth, eyes wide, as though even that joy might get her punished. But when Elias pushed himself up, brushing dirt from his coat, he looked at her and, to her astonishment, chuckled. It was a deep sound, warm and rusty, like a door creaking open that had not been used in years. For a moment, the silence between them was not a wall but a bridge. They looked at each other not as a frightened girl and a mysterious man, but simply as two people caught in the same moment. The corners of Marybeth's lips curled again, slower this time, more certain. She wiped her hands on her apron and walked over to where he was brushing hay from his shoulder. She knelt beside him, eyes searching his face. "Why are you alone?" she asked, her voice barely louder than the wind moving through the branches. He didn't answer, not right away. His eyes, gray as a storm about to break, held hers for a beat longer than before. Something moved behind them, something old and wounded and guarded like a door nailed shut from the inside. Then he turned away. Elias stood, nodded once, and walked to retrieve the goat, who was now chewing smugly on a sprig of mint. He said nothing more that day, nor the next. But Marybeth didn't press, because something had happened, something real. She had laughed, he had smiled, and in that small, muddy, ridiculous moment, they had stepped out of their isolation, if only for a breath. The forest remained quiet around them, but the quiet had changed. It was no longer lonely. The morning came with a cool breeze and a pale sun, its light slanting gently across the clearing as birds returned to their low chatter in the trees. Marybeth was gathering kindling just past the garden when she heard the crunch of wagon wheels along the path, unusual, this far into the woods. She set the bundle down and watched, cautious but curious. A small cart came into view, pulled by a donkey with a sway in its step. At the reins sat a round woman wrapped in a gray shawl, her face worn and kind beneath a wide-brimmed hat. Her hands were stained with the deep brown of wild roots, and the basket beside her rattled with glass jars. She stopped just before the porch and called out, voice steady. "Elias?" she said. "I've brought more valerian, and some dried willow bark, if that shoulder's still giving you trouble." Elias stepped out from behind the cabin, his expression unreadable. He nodded once, and the woman climbed down, her joints stiff but her movements practiced. As she approached the porch, her eyes fell on Marybeth standing near the woodshed, the edge of her apron still dusted with bark. Miss Gertie froze, her breath caught, sharp and audible. "Dear Lord," she whispered, almost to herself. She took a step forward, peering at Marybeth with a trembling sort of recognition. You're Charles Gentry's girl, aren't you?" Marybeth stiffened, her hands curled at her sides. Gertie's gaze softened, and she stepped forward slowly, like one might approach a wounded animal. "You've grown," she said quietly. "Last I saw you, you were just a child. God help us." Elias didn't speak. He watched from the porch, arms crossed, as though bracing for what might come next. "I heard rumors," Gertie continued, her voice tight. "Whispers about Wetlock, about what he did to you, but no one spoke plain, and no one did a thing." She closed her eyes a moment, then reached out gently. "You're safe here?" Marybeth gave a small nod. "And you trust him?" Gertie asked, tilting her head toward Elias. Another nod, firmer this time. The midwife exhaled slowly, her shoulders easing. "Then I thank God for that." She took her basket inside to set down the herbs, and Marybeth followed, curiosity prickling at her edges. Inside the cabin, as Gertie sorted jars on the shelf and laid a packet of dried flowers on the table, she spoke in a quieter tone. "He wasn't always like this," she said, without looking up. "Elias, he used to come to town every week, sat in the front pew at church with his wife Lydia, that was her name. Sweetest thing. Smelled like lavender. She was heavy with child, the winter the river iced over. The day it broke early, he was out splitting wood. Came back to find the baby born early, and Lydia," her voice faltered, "the midwife didn't arrive in time." Marybeth swallowed, her fingers tightening around the hem of her skirt. "They say he carried them both all the way to town," Gertie said. But the doctor could only shake his head. After the burial, Elias vanished. Folks figured he'd lost his mind. Some said he turned into a beast up in the hills. She looked Marybeth in the eyes then. "But beasts don't make gardens, or carve brushes, or mend girls broken by men who should have protected them." Elias stood in the doorway, silent as ever. But his eyes flicked toward them, and for just a moment, Marybeth thought she saw sorrow not fresh, but long settled, like dust on an unopened book. Miss Gertie gathered her things to leave, pausing at the door. "If you ever need a woman's ear," she said, "you send word, I'll come." Then she was gone, cart rattling down the trail. And in her wake, Marybeth sat alone at the table, her thoughts a storm of aching pieces, her own pain, and now his, layered like soil in the same hard ground. The afternoon was quiet, steeped in a kind of hush that only came when the wind held its breath. Elias had gone down the ridge to mend a fence near the creek, his tools bundled on his shoulder, the goats trailing behind him like slow, stubborn shadows. Marybeth stood on the porch and watched until the forest swallowed him whole. Then, with nothing pressing to do, she stepped back into the cabin and let the silence settle around her. It had become a kind silence, a companionable one, but today it felt different, not heavier, just curious. Her eyes drifted across the room, the tidy shelves, the firewood stacked just so, the simple bedroll near the hearth. Everything in the cabin had its place. Everything except the small uneven board near the hearthstone, which she had noticed days before but never touched, until now. She knelt and ran her fingers along the edge of the floor. The wood there was loose, the grain splintered slightly as though lifted and lowered many times. With a hesitant tug, the board came free, revealing a shallow space beneath the floor. Inside was a trunk not large, but old, its leather straps worn and faded, its brass latch dulled by time. She paused, breath caught halfway. This was not hers, but something in the way it lay hidden, so carefully placed, made her feel as though it waited for someone to look. Someone to remember. Her hands moved before her thoughts did. She unlatched the trunk and lifted the lid. Inside were baby clothes folded neatly, still smelling faintly of lavender and ash. A tiny bonnet with a blue ribbon, a pair of booties so small they fit in her palm. Tucked between them was a broken locket. Its chain snapped, the image inside too faded to make out clearly. Her fingers brushed it, then moved to the envelope resting at the bottom, sealed once, but now open and worn. The letter inside was short. She read it slowly, eyes scanning each word as though it might vanish if she moved too quickly. Elias, I'm scared. The pains are worse, and you've been gone longer than you said. If this letter finds you, I want you to know I forgive you, and I love you, even if I don't make it through. Take care of her. Take care of yourself. You're not alone. L. The ink had run in places. Tears, likely. Old, dried, but still aching. Marybeth sat still for a long time, the letter open in her lap, her own eyes burning now. She didn't realize Elias had returned until she heard the soft creak of the door. He stood in the doorway, shadowed by the dimming sky. His eyes fell on the open trunk, the letter in her hands, the locket resting beside her. She looked up, throat tight. Lips parted to speak, but nothing came. He didn't yell. He didn't even step forward. He only looked at her with a stillness so deep it seemed to hollow out the room. Then, without a word, he turned and stepped back into the fading light, his figure swallowed by the trees. Night came. The fire crackled low. Marybeth left the letter where it had been and did not move the trunk. She curled into the quilt in the loft, the silence no longer companionable but waiting for the sound of boots, or breath, or healing. But they did not come, and outside, the forest wept with rain. The first light of morning touched the trees with a pale, forgiving gold. The rain had stopped sometime in the night, leaving behind a hush broken only by the drip of water from pine needles and the soft stir of waking birds. Marybeth hadn't slept. She lay curled in the loft, wrapped in the quilt but untouched by rest, her eyes fixed on the narrow window and the first sign of light through the mist. Then she heard its slow footsteps on the porch. Not the heavy tread of a stranger, but the quiet, measured return of someone who carried weight, not in his pack, but in his soul. Elias had come back. She rose, descended the ladder barefoot, and stood at the bottom, watching as he pushed the door open and stepped inside. His clothes were damp with morning dew, his beard darker with rain, and his eyes, those gray eyes, held something different now. Not the hard silence she had come to know, but something more open. Fragile, almost. He didn't speak right away. He removed his coat, hung it by the door, and stood for a long moment facing the fire, though it had long gone to embers. I thought I could carry it alone, he said finally, voice rough, low, not looking at her. I was wrong. Marybeth said nothing. She waited. He turned slightly, enough for the light to catch the sharp planes of his face, softened only by weariness. Lydia, my wife, she went into labor early. Storm came in hard that winter, worse than anyone expected. I'd gone to fetch the midwife. Didn't think I'd be more than a few hours. He paused, jaw tight. I got caught. Tree fell across the trail, took the long way back. By the time I returned, she'd already given birth, alone. His voice cracked on the word. She was gone. The baby, she was alive. A breath, deep and shaky. I named her Ruth, after my mother. His hands tightened at his sides. I wrapped her up, carried her to town. Couldn't think, couldn't feel anything but the cold. Marybeth's heart ached as she imagined it. The man who now split wood with bare hands, stumbling through snow with a newborn. Fresh grief clawing at his throat. The doctor said she was strong, said she'd live, and she did, for 3 days. His voice faltered. Third night, storm hit again. Firewood was low. I went out to chop more. I was only gone, maybe 10 minutes. He looked at her then. Really looked. When I came back, the door was open, tracks in the snow. They found her a mile down, said it was wolves, but the town didn't forgive, said I left her, said I was cursed. He lowered his head. I didn't argue, because they were right. I failed her. I failed both of them. The silence after was different than any they'd shared before, thick with truth, with pain laid bare like broken wood after a storm. Marybeth crossed the space between them, slow and quiet. She didn't reach for him. She simply stood near, close enough for the warmth of the fire and her presence to touch him at once. "You didn't fail," she said, voice low. "You survived. And you saved me." Elias said nothing, but his shoulders, always drawn like taut rope, lowered just a little. Outside, the sun climbed higher, and inside, for the first time in a very long while, Elias sat down beside someone who didn't fear him and didn't blame him but simply stayed. The wind had shifted that morning. It carried the smell of dust instead of pine, a dryness that clung to the back of the throat like a warning. Marybeth stood in the garden, pulling weeds between rows of sprouting cabbage, when the sound of hooves broke the usual hush. She looked up, heart already tightening in her chest. No one ever came up this far unless they meant to. Elias stepped out of the cabin before she could call for him, his axe in hand, his eyes already narrowing as two riders emerged from the trail. The first was unmistakable, the trader. His slicked back hair was matted with sweat, and he wore a self-satisfied sneer like armor. Behind him rode a broader man in a tan coat and tin badge dulled with scratches, the sheriff. He had the look of someone who had long ago traded justice for paperwork. "Well, I'll be," the trader called, reining in his horse and glancing toward Marybeth with a twisted grin. "There she is. Wasn't sure you'd still be in one piece. Big as she is, figured a bear might have mistaken her for supper." Elias said nothing. He stepped down from the porch, slow and steady, the axe still in his hand, but lowered. The sheriff dismounted and pulled a folded paper from his coat. "Name's Sheriff Dalton. This here's Mr. Reddick, who claims you're harboring his rightful property. His just of Eddiewas commons, he's not of hay." "I'm not property," Marybeth said, the words leaving her mouth before fear could swallow them. Reddick snorted. "That's not what the law says, girl. Your father sold you. $3, fair and witnessed. You ran off, but I've come to collect. No harm done, if she comes quiet." "She didn't run," Elias said at last, voice like gravel rubbed between calloused hands. "You left her to die." The sheriff unfolded the paper and held it up. "This deed says otherwise. Written, signed, and filed in town. Whether you agree with the terms or not, the law recognizes Mr. Reddick's claim. If there's a dispute, it'll be settled properly. In town." Elias's jaw tightened. The air around him seemed to still, the forest itself leaning in. "She's not going with you." "Now see here," the sheriff said, tucking the paper away, his tone shifting. "I don't want trouble, and I don't want to come back with a warrant and half the county at my side. We'll hold a hearing. If she's got anything to say, she can say it there. But we settle this the right way." Marybeth stepped closer to Elias, her hands shaking. "I won't go back." "You don't have to," Elias murmured, low enough for only her to hear. Then he turned his eyes back to the sheriff. "We'll come." Reddick blinked. "What?" "You said she could speak, so she will." Elias stared hard at the lawman. "In front of your people, with witnesses." The sheriff looked uneasy but nodded. "Sunday, at the church hall." With that, the men mounted again, the trader grinning as if he'd already won. They turned back down the trail, hooves kicking up dirt and silence in their wake. Elias stood still long after they were gone, the paper's threat lingering like smoke. Marybeth swallowed hard. "They won't believe me." He looked down at her, eyes steady. "Then we'll make them listen." The road into Wetlock felt longer than it had before. The trees thinned too quickly, the hills flattening into worn paths marked by old ruts and the ghost of old choices. Marybeth sat beside Elias on the buckboard of Miss Gertie's cart, her hands clenched in her lap, eyes fixed on the town that grew steadily before them like a wound reopening. Elias drove the mule without a word, the reins loose in his hands, his face unreadable. They passed the outskirts' first weathered cabins, sagging fences, eyes peeking through curtains. By the time they reached the main square, the whispers had started, and then came the voices. "Is that her? Lord, she's even bigger now. Thought she'd be dead by now, or breeding goats for that giant." Children pointed. Men chuckled behind cupped hands. Women crossed their arms, their mouths pressed thin. Someone muttered, "That's the fat girl who got sold like a cow." Another added, "Now she thinks she's too good for the law." Marybeth kept her gaze forward, the flush in her cheeks burning against the chill in the air. Her hands trembled slightly, but she refused to fold them tighter. She would not look down, not here, not now. Elias remained silent beside her, his presence as solid and immovable as the stone foundation of the church rising ahead. He didn't shield her from the stares. He didn't speak against the names. He simply stood tall, a monument of quiet defiance, a shadow that would not bend. Miss Gertie had arrived ahead of them, already speaking with the preacher near the chapel steps. She wore her best shawl, silver hair tied back, a ledger clutched in one hand, and fire in her eyes. As Marybeth stepped down from the cart, Gertie came to her side and looped an arm through hers without asking. "We're not here to beg," she whispered. "We're here to be heard." The sheriff stood at the chapel door, his face drawn, the lines around his eyes deeper than before. "Hearing Sunday, 2 days. You'll stay in town till then." "I'll watch them," Gertie said before Elias could speak. "She can stay at my place. Elias too, if need be. That's what the old parsonage was for." The sheriff nodded. "Fine. Just don't stir the pot." "Oh, we plan to stir it," she said with a thin smile. "Truth's been sitting at the bottom for far too long." That evening, the church bell rang out over the valley, announcing the hearing. Notices were nailed to the town board. Gertie moved quickly, speaking with the old midwife who had tried to help Lydia that winter, the blacksmith whose wife Elias once carried across a floodplain, the grocer who'd been quietly slipping him extra seed each spring. And Marybeth? She sat at Gertie's table, pen in hand, sketching the faces of those who had helped, those who had harmed, and the line between them. She drew the church with its steeple bent slightly to the east, the pews filled with townsfolk holding more judgment than faith. She did not draw herself, not yet, but she would. After Sunday, when her voice would rise in a room that once turned its back, when the town would be forced to see not just the fat girl who was sold but the woman who had come back, unbroken. The town of Wetlock buzzed with whispers the day before the hearing, a low and constant murmur like wind sliding under every door. People spoke in corners, behind crates at the mercantile, under the cracked eaves of the church steps. Their voices carried half-truths and fears dressed as fact. The same men who had once shared drinks with Elias muttered now that he was mad, cursed by the wilderness. Women who had accepted his chopped wood during bitter winters now whispered to each other that men who vanished into the hills weren't meant to return. But not everyone turned their back. "I remember when Elias fixed the mill wheel for free," said the baker's wife, twisting her apron in her hands. "Didn't ask for coin. Didn't ask for thanks. He saved our boy when he fell through the ice," murmured the barber, eyes darting around to be sure no one overheard. "Don't forget," came another voice, sharper. "He left his own baby to die. Man like that can't be trusted." At the churchyard, the crowd split down lines not drawn on maps but carved in memory. Some wore pity like a badge, others suspicion like armor, but all of them were watching, weighing, waiting to see if guilt could ever become grace. Inside Miss Gertie's cottage, Marybeth sat at the small writing table by the window, the sun spilling over her shoulders in quiet light. Her hands were stained with charcoal and smudged with ink. She had drawn all morning, pages spread across the table, her heart pouring onto the paper with more honesty than she could speak aloud. One sketch showed her, curled and hollow in the wagon, eyes wide with shame. Another, Elias's hand extended, not grabbing, not taking, just offering a blanket in the cold. She drew the goat, legs flailing in stubborn joy, and Elias falling back into mud as laughter bloomed on her face for the first time in years. She drew the brush he carved for her, the squirrel she'd nursed, the fire that never once burned too low beneath his watch. And then she drew the cabin, not the structure itself, but what it had become, a place of safety, of silence that healed rather than harmed. When she finished, she laid the sketches out in a slow, deliberate line. Gertie, standing beside her with a cup of tea untouched in her hand, looked down and let out a soft breath. "They'll speak louder than you think," she said. Marybeth nodded. "I don't know if they'll believe me, but they'll see. They'll see what he's done, and what he hasn't." Outside, children ran past the fence, one calling out cruelly, fat girls drawing pictures for her giant husband. Marybeth flinched, but didn't tear the paper. She was tired of being small. Later that evening, she carried the sketches to the church. The door was unlocked. The room was empty. She laid them out along the front pews, one after another, like steps in a journey only she had taken but that others now needed to walk. She stood there a long time, the shadows growing long across the floorboards. Then she left the church in silence, her head held higher than it had ever been in that town. The church bell tolled once, then again, its heavy sound rolling over Wetlock like thunder on a still morning. Inside the chapel, the pews creaked under the weight of curious bodies and uncomfortable consciences. The air was thick, not with incense or prayer, but with judgment. Dust floated in golden shafts through the tall windows, settling on hymnals untouched and hearts unopened. Marybeth sat near the front, her sketches spread across a long table in silent testimony. Elias stood behind her, towering and still, arms folded but not closed off. His presence was not a challenge, it was a promise, that whatever happened here, she would not stand alone. The preacher had not come. Whether out of fear or pride, no one asked. So it was Miss Gertie who stepped up to the pulpit, small and bent but rooted like the oldest tree in the valley. She wore her best Sunday hat, the same one she'd worn to bury her husband and to deliver more babies than anyone could count. Her hands trembled slightly as she laid her notes down, but her voice, when it came, was clear and strong. "I'm not here today to weigh law," she began, scanning the room. "The sheriff can read deeds, and the judge can make rulings, but I came to speak about weight of another kind." A murmur rippled down the pews, uncertain and low. "You see," she continued, "there's a story I once heard, long before many of you were born, about a girl who was given a stone every time someone called her too much to carry, too much to look at, too much to love. She was just a child, but her pockets filled quick stones of shame, of ridicule, of names whispered behind hands and shouted in barns. She looked out at them all, her eyes glinting like polished river rock. Eventually, she began to carry those stones not in her pockets, but in her heart. She believed the weight meant she had less worth, that she had to earn back space, earn back breath, that she was only ever what others decided she could be." Silence fell. A woman in the back dabbed at her eyes. A man coughed into his hand and looked away. "But one day, someone saw her not as burden," Gertie said, voice softening, "but as someone burdened, not as weight, but as wounded, and that changed everything." She gestured toward the table, toward the drawings that now caught light like stained glass on paper. "Every page here is a stone she's set down, every line a step toward worth that no one gave her because it was hers all along." She looked toward Marybeth then, and her voice rose. "I have known Elias Walker since he was a boy. I saw him bring his child into town with frozen hands. I saw him bury a wife with no words left to speak. And I have watched him, since, do what many of you never dared grieve honestly. Live quietly, protect something precious, even after he'd lost everything." The room swelled with breath held too long. A few heads bowed. One man removed his hat. "If you still believe," Gertie said, "that what's legal is always what's right, then perhaps you've forgotten what this church was built for." She stepped down, slow but steady, her words still hanging in the wooden rafters. And in her wake, something began to shift. Not loudly, not all at once, but it started in the way a neighbor leaned closer, the way a murmur passed with less certainty and more shame. A young girl touched Marybeth's sketch of the cabin and smiled. An old man said, softly, "Maybe I was wrong." For the first time in a long time, the town listened. And Marybeth exhaled. The morning of the hearing broke over Wetlock, with a hush that felt different from the day before, not silence born of suspicion, but one of waiting. In the church, townsfolk filled the pews again, but this time they avoided the usual whispers. They had seen Marybeth's sketches, heard Miss Gertie's words, and the weight of their own silence over the years pressed heavy on their chests. Marybeth sat at the front beside Elias, her hands folded in her lap. She wore the same dress she'd arrived in months ago, patched and softened by time, her hair pulled back with care. There was no effort to dress for show, only for truth. Sheriff Dalton stood near the altar with a paper in hand, his face grim. Beside him, the traitor Reddick leaned on the edge of the pulpit, cocky and too comfortable for a man who had sold a child like a loaf of bread. His smirk faltered only slightly when Miss Gertie entered through the side door, a worn leather-bound book held tightly to her chest. "Before we begin," she said, walking with firm, slow steps to the front, "I have something to add to the record." The sheriff raised an eyebrow. "You're not counsel." "I'm something better," Gertie replied. "A witness." She opened the book, its pages delicate with age, and pulled from between them a folded piece of paper, its edges soft and yellowed. "This," she said, holding it up, "is the original family record from the Gentry household. Marybeth's birth certificate, written and signed by her mother before she passed. I witnessed it myself when that child came into the world. Her mother was a good woman who died too soon. And her father," her eyes flicked toward Reddick, "had no right to sell her like stock at market." Reddick scoffed. "She was mine to take. I paid him." Gertie narrowed her eyes. "You forged the transaction. That receipt you carry wasn't notarized, wasn't witnessed, and wasn't dated. And I've got proof because I still have the ink pad and family seal from that time, and your paper shows none of it." Dalton took the certificate with careful hands, reading it slowly. "This your handwriting, Gertie?" "It is, and you know it." He held the page up beside Reddick's deed, his jaw tightening. "This isn't legal tender, it's a lie." "You calling me a liar?" Reddick growled. "I'm calling you a criminal," the sheriff said. "And if the marshal hears of this, you'll face worse than a hearing." A wave of murmurs rolled through the church. This time, they weren't whispers of judgment but surprise, even support. Marybeth felt her breath catch in her throat. She looked toward Elias, whose gaze remained fixed on Reddick, cold and unmoving. "This hearing is closed," Dalton said, folding the forged deed. "The girl is not your property. She never was. You've got an hour to leave this town." But Reddick didn't move. His smile curled mean, and he took a slow step forward. "You think this ends with some scribble in a Bible?" he hissed. "You think a fat girl and a hermit can outlive what the world really is?" Elias stepped forward then, not fast, not loud, just enough that the floorboards creaked beneath his weight. His hands hung loose at his sides, but the room tensed with the knowledge that this was not a man who moved without cause. Reddick stopped. Dalton raised a hand. "Don't make this worse." For a moment, the traitor looked ready to lunge, to shout, to strike, but he saw something in Elias's face that turned his courage into something smaller, meaner. He spat on the floor, turned on his heel, and shoved through the church doors into the daylight beyond. Marybeth sat still as the room exhaled. For the first time, the world had called her by her name, not her weight, not her shame, and it had believed her. The sun hung high over Wetlock's town square, casting sharp shadows across the dirt-packed road and worn storefronts. People had begun to trickle out of the church, their voices hushed with a mixture of awe and discomfort, as if the truth spoken within its walls had unsettled more than just the morning air. Marybeth lingered near the steps, her eyes searching the faces now turned toward her with something softer, no longer judgment, but recognition. Then came the sound of hooves fast and angry. Reddick rode in hard, dust spinning around him like fury. His face was red, twisted, and slick with sweat, the smug grin from earlier replaced by something far more dangerous. The sheriff had warned him to leave, but some men didn't know how to go quietly. He pulled the horse up short in front of the church, his coat flapping, his breath heaving with rage. Townsfolk stilled, conversations died mid-sentence, and in the breath between steps, the traitor pulled a pistol from under his coat. "Where is she?" he bellowed. "You think I'll let this end with some backwater sermon and a scrawled scrap of paper? That girl's mine. I paid blood for her." Marybeth froze at the edge of the steps. The pistol gleamed in the light, shaking in his grip but no less deadly for it. Before she could move, Elias stepped between them. He moved without panic, solid, deliberate, his body forming a wall between her and the threat. His hands were empty, his stance calm, but his presence radiated something cold and final. The kind of calm that didn't yield, the kind that made men second-guess their bravado. "Step aside, mountain man," Reddick snarled, raising the gun. "You don't scare me anymore." "You never were scared enough," Elias said, voice low even. "That was your mistake." The crowd had begun to gather again, drawn by the shouting. Miss Gertie stood beside the apothecary, her jaw tight. The town blacksmith, a broad man named Hollis with hands like anvils, stepped closer from the other side of the square. Others watched, unsure, the line between fear and courage drawing thin. Reddick lifted the gun higher, and that's when Hollis moved. With a grunt, the blacksmith charged from behind the fountain, barreling into Reddick's side. The traitor stumbled, gun jerking upward as it discharged with a sharp, ear-splitting crack, missing everyone, the shot lost in the air. The weapon clattered to the ground as Hollis wrestled him down, pinning his arm with practiced force. Then came another Mrs. Kendry, the grocer's wife, who kicked the pistol away with the heel of her boot. Then, a pair of stable boys jumped in to hold Reddick's legs, and an old farmer tossed a coil of rope with surprising precision. By the time Sheriff Dalton arrived, the traitor was already bound, cursing and sputtering in the dirt, surrounded by the same townspeople who had once turned away from justice. "You've made your case," Dalton said, hauling him to his feet. "Now you'll make your sentence in a real court." Elias didn't speak. He turned back to Marybeth, whose face was pale but steady. She hadn't run. She hadn't hidden. She had stayed, eyes wide, heart racing, but unshaken. The sheriff loaded Reddick into a wagon, and as it pulled away, the crowd didn't scatter as usual. They stayed. Together. Quietly, someone reached out to clasp Marybeth's hand, then another, and another. Justice had not arrived on the back of one man's strength, but by the hands of many, finally willing to carry the weight they once ignored. And in the middle of the square, beneath the noon sun and the settling dust, Marybeth stood taller than she ever had before. The mountain air felt different now, lighter, somehow, as if the land itself had exhaled after holding its breath for too many years. Summer ripened slowly across the ridge, and the pine trees swayed with something gentler than wind alone. At the edge of the forest clearing, the garden grew wider with each week, rows of cabbage and beans pushing up through rich, dark soil that had once only known silence. Marybeth knelt in the shade of a tall sunflower, her hands buried in the earth as she showed a wide-eyed boy how to tell weeds from vegetables. His name was Jonah, the son of a widow from the valley, and he had been quiet for days when he first arrived until she'd handed him a trowel and pointed toward the dirt. Now, he asked questions about worms and roots, and how tall beans could climb if no one told them to stop. Every few weeks, new faces came up the mountain trail. Not many, just enough. Children too quiet, mothers too tired, a man with a limp and a haunted gaze, a girl who flinched at raised voices. They came without fanfare, led by word of mouth, and soft invitations passed through town like prayers. And each time, Elias built another cabin, never in a rush, never more than needed. He used wood from the forest, stone from the creek bed, and nails he forged himself with the old tools passed down through silence and grief. The cabins weren't grand, but they were strong, warm. They faced east, toward the morning light. Marybeth had turned the loft of the original cabin into a small schoolroom. A slate hung from a nail near the window, and the walls were pinned with her drawings, simple lessons of birds, leaves, words, and kindness. The children gathered on the floor, cross-legged, pencils in hand, their voices filling the space where once there had been only sorrow. Elias didn't speak much still, but he watched. He repaired broken shoes, carved toys from spare wood, showed the older boys how to split firewood without wasting effort. The children didn't fear him. They followed him like ducks in a line, calling him Mr. Elias, and sometimes, in whispers, the giant. The goat, one of many, now had given birth to twins. They tottered on shaky legs through the yard, butted heads, and learned to climb anything that stood still too long. Marybeth laughed as they climbed up her skirt, then settled beside her with contented sighs, chewing grass and dreams. The nights were quiet, filled with the crackle of fire and the creak of wind in the trees. But it was not the same quiet that had once blanketed the ridge. It was not lonely. They shared meals outside on long tables Elias had built by hand. They told stories. They remembered without bitterness and dreamed without fear. The garden yielded more than they needed, and what they didn't use was brought to town, where Wetlock had learned, slowly and with effort, how to ask for forgiveness, not with words, but with open hands and second chances. Marybeth stood beneath the wide sky one evening, the children's laughter echoing through the trees, the smell of baking bread drifting from a nearby chimney. She looked over the cabins, the garden, the ridge. This wasn't the place she'd been taken to. It was the one she'd helped build. My dearest daughter, if you're reading this, then the sun has already touched the garden this morning, and the goats have likely begun their stubborn chorus outside the window. I imagine your hair is tangled and your feet are bare, and I hope you never learn to be ashamed of either. I'm writing this not because I fear forgetting, but because some things are too sacred to trust only to memory. Once, I was sold for $3. I was 16. Obese, they called me, though never with kindness. A girl with wide hips and a quiet voice, traded like livestock by the man who should have protected me. They tied my wrists, shoved me into a wagon, and told me my life wasn't mine, and for a long time I believed them. I believed my body was something to be hidden, my voice something to be silenced, my dreams something to bury beneath the weight of shame. But I was never worthless. You should know that, because what followed the mountain, the man, the silence that taught me how to listen, it all began the day I was left behind and found instead. His name was Elias, though I called him only what he gave me: safety. He did not ask questions. He did not flinch at the sight of my scars or the way I took up space. He simply made room. He taught me that broken things don't need to be hidden, that wounds, when given quiet and warmth, become places where light can grow. He once lost a child. I know that pain still follows him like a shadow. But through me, and now through you, he has built again. You've walked the paths he carved. You've slept in the cabins we raised with our own hands. You've seen the garden we planted flourish, not just with food but with people, each one carrying their own ache, their own longing to be known and not punished for it. They come to this place not because it is perfect, but because here they are not required to pretend. That is the legacy you inherit. Not just the soil beneath your feet, but the truth that no one can define your worth. Not the cruel, not the fearful, not even the voices in your own mind. Your value is not negotiable. It is yours. It always has been. As I fold this letter and tuck it beneath your pillow, I can hear the laughter of children chasing chickens, the hum of a song someone's humming while kneading bread, the sound of Elias's axe in the woodpile. Life continues, and I have found my place in it not as something tolerated, but as someone needed. The sign at the edge of the ridge is new, carved yesterday, nailed with care into cedar. It reads, "Welcome to Sanctuary Ridge," and beneath it, in smaller letters, "All are worthy here. With all my love, Mama."